When Isabel Thornwick started selling black roses in Silver Falls, the townspeople thought it was just an eccentric business choice. But within 3 months, every person who had bought one of her dark bouquets was dead. What the residents didn't know was that Isabel's flowers weren't just marking people for death. They were part of the most sophisticated assassination network in the American West. But to understand how a gentle flower seller became the coordinator of the deadliest conspiracy in Colorado territory, we need to go back to where it all started. Back to a spring morning in 1876, when Isabel discovered that some secrets are worth killing for, and some people are worth dying to protect. Isabel Thornwick had arrived in Silver Falls in the spring of 1871 as a young widow carrying nothing but a carpet bag filled with flower seeds and a heart full of determination to start over. At 28 years old, she had already endured more tragedy than most people face in a lifetime. Her husband had been killed in the war, her family farm in Ohio had been lost to creditors, and she had made the difficult decision to travel west in search of the fresh start that so many other displaced souls were seeking in the territories. Silver Falls was a growing mining town nestled in a valley between two mountain ranges, sustained by the rich silver deposits that had been discovered in the surrounding hills. The community of nearly 1,500 residents was rough around the edges, but possessed the optimistic energy that characterized most frontier settlements. People came to Silver Falls hoping to strike it rich in the mines, but they stayed because they found something more valuable than silver: a chance to build meaningful lives in a place where a person's past mattered less than their willingness to work hard and contribute to the community. Isabel's flower shop quickly became one of Silver Falls' most beloved institutions. She established her business in a small building on Main Street, transforming what had been a dreary space into a garden paradise filled with colorful blooms, sweet fragrances, and the kind of natural beauty that reminded people of the gentler world they had left behind in pursuit of fortune and adventure. Her flowers brought joy to celebrations, comfort to funerals, and romance to courtships, making her an essential part of the emotional life of the community. But Isabel's real gift wasn't just her ability to grow beautiful flowers. It was her extraordinary talent for listening to people and understanding their deepest needs and fears. Customers would come to her shop ostensibly to buy arrangements for special occasions, but they would end up sharing their most intimate concerns and seeking her advice about everything from family problems to business difficulties. Isabel had a way of making people feel heard and understood, and her wisdom and compassion made her a trusted confidant for many of Silver Falls residents. This reputation for discretion and empathy eventually brought Isabel into contact with information that would change her life forever. In the winter of 1875, a young woman named Emily Morrison came to her flower shop in a state of distress that went far beyond the usual troubles that brought customers seeking comfort among the roses and daisies. Emily was the daughter of Judge Morrison, one of Silver Falls' most respected citizens and a man whose decisions from the bench affected the lives of everyone in the territory. She had discovered something in her father's private papers that revealed he was not the upstanding pillar of justice that the community believed him to be. Judge Morrison was actually the leader of a criminal conspiracy that had been systematically robbing, extorting, and murdering innocent people throughout Colorado territory for over 5 years. The evidence Emily had found was overwhelming and horrifying. Judge Morrison was working with a network of corrupt officials, crooked businessmen, and hired killers to steal mining claims, manipulate legal proceedings, and eliminate anyone who threatened to expose their activities. They had murdered dozens of people, including several families who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time when the conspiracy needed to cover its tracks. Emily had brought this information to Isabel because she didn't know who else she could trust. If her father was corrupt, how many other officials in Silver Falls might be part of the conspiracy? How could she know which lawmen were honest and which were working with the criminals? Most importantly, how could she expose the truth without putting herself and other innocent people in mortal danger? Isabel's response to Emily's dilemma revealed a side of her character that none of her customers had ever suspected. Beneath her gentle exterior was a core of steel that had been forged by years of loss and hardship. She had seen too much injustice and suffering to stand by passively when she had the opportunity to help bring criminals to justice, even if it meant putting herself at risk. But Isabel was also practical enough to understand that conventional approaches to exposing the conspiracy would be useless and dangerous. If Judge Morrison and his associates controlled the local legal system, simply reporting the crimes to authorities would accomplish nothing except alerting the criminals that their activities had been discovered. Emily and anyone who tried to help her would end up dead, and the conspiracy would continue operating with even greater caution and brutality. What was needed was a way to gather evidence and coordinate with honest law enforcement officials outside of Silver Falls without alerting the local conspiracy to what was happening. This required a communication system that could operate in plain sight without arousing suspicion, and a network of trusted individuals who could work together to document crimes and protect potential witnesses. That was when Isabel conceived the idea that would transform her flower shop into the headquarters of the most effective anti-corruption operation in territorial history. She would use her business as a front for an intelligence network that could gather information about the conspiracy's activities and coordinate with federal authorities who had the power to investigate and prosecute crimes that crossed territorial boundaries. The key to the operation was developing a coded communication system that could operate through normal business transactions without anyone realizing that sensitive information was being exchanged. Isabel's solution was brilliant in its simplicity and effectiveness. She would use different types of flowers and arrangements to convey specific messages about criminal activities, potential witnesses, and planned operations. A bouquet of yellow roses might indicate that a witness needed protection. Red carnations could signal that a crime was planned for a specific date and location. White lilies might mean that it was safe to proceed with an investigation. Most importantly, black roses, flowers that Isabel would have to specially cultivate since they didn't occur naturally, would be used to mark individuals who were part of the criminal conspiracy and needed to be monitored or investigated. The black roses weren't marking people for death, as the townspeople would later believe. They were marking criminals for justice, identifying members of the conspiracy so that federal agents could build cases against them and gather evidence of their crimes. But the process of exposing the conspiracy would indeed lead to many deaths, as the criminals began eliminating each other and anyone they perceived as a threat to their operations. Isabel spent months developing her cultivation techniques and establishing connections with federal law enforcement officials who could act on the intelligence she gathered. She corresponded with territorial marshals, federal prosecutors, and Treasury investigators who were already aware that organized criminal activity was operating in Colorado territory, but had been unable to penetrate the networks or gather sufficient evidence for prosecutions. The first black rose bouquet was delivered in March 1876 to Deputy Sheriff William Hawkins, a man who Emily Morrison's evidence had identified as one of Judge Morrison's key collaborators in manipulating legal proceedings and intimidating witnesses. The bouquet was delivered with a note explaining that it was a gift from an admirer who appreciated his service to the community, but the real message was being sent to federal agents who were now watching Hawkins and documenting his illegal activities. Within days of receiving his black roses, Hawkins began exhibiting the paranoid behavior of a man who suspected he was being investigated. He started varying his routines, meeting with associates in unusual locations, and generally acting like someone who was trying to avoid surveillance. His suspicious behavior actually made it easier for federal agents to identify his criminal associates and observe their operations. The pattern was repeated over the following months as Isabel delivered black rose bouquets to other members of the conspiracy. Each delivery served multiple purposes. It identified criminals for federal investigators. It created psychological pressure that sometimes led to confessions or mistakes, and it gradually destabilized the criminal network by making everyone suspicious of everyone else. But the Black Roses had an unintended consequence that would eventually expose Isabel's operation and put her life in danger. As members of the conspiracy began dying or disappearing, some killed by federal agents during arrests, others murdered by their own associates to prevent them from cooperating with authorities, the people of Silver Falls began to notice a disturbing pattern. Everyone who had received Black Roses from Isabel Thornwick was ending up dead. The first person to voice suspicions was Mrs. Catherine Walsh, a shopkeeper who had always been jealous of Isabel's success and popularity. Mrs. Walsh began pointing out the connection between the Black Roses and the deaths, suggesting that Isabel might be involved in some kind of witchcraft or curse that was bringing misfortune to her customers. Her accusations might have been dismissed as gossip, except for the fact that the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. By the fall of 1876, 17 people who had received Black Roses from Isabel were dead, and several others had fled town under mysterious circumstances. The coincidence was too dramatic to explain away, and people began to wonder if the gentle flower seller might be harboring dark secrets. The situation became critical when Judge Morrison himself began to suspect that his criminal network was being systematically exposed by someone with access to inside information. He had noticed that federal agents seemed to be anticipating his operations and targeting his associates with suspicious accuracy. Most troubling of all, he had learned that his own daughter Emily had been asking questions about his private papers and meeting with people outside the family. Judge Morrison's investigation into the security breaches affecting his conspiracy led him directly to Isabel Thornwick. He discovered that Emily had been visiting the flower shop regularly, and he noticed that every person who had been arrested or killed by federal agents had previously received Black Roses from Isabel's business. The judge was smart enough to realize that the flower shop was being used as a communication center for an intelligence operation directed against his criminal network. But Judge Morrison was also ruthless enough to understand that eliminating Isabel would require careful planning and execution. She had clearly established connections with federal law enforcement officials, and killing her in an obvious way would only confirm that she had been gathering legitimate evidence about criminal activities. Instead, he needed to discredit her and destroy her intelligence network, while making her death look like the result of community justice rather than criminal retaliation. The judge's solution was to manipulate the growing superstitions about Isabel's Black Roses and turn the townspeople against her. He began spreading rumors that Isabel was practicing witchcraft and using her flowers to place curses on innocent people. He suggested that the deaths of Black Rose recipients were the result of supernatural forces rather than criminal activity, and he encouraged people to view Isabel as a dangerous threat to the community's safety and moral well-being. The campaign against Isabel was sophisticated and effective. Judge Morrison used his position and reputation to give credibility to the accusations, while his criminal associates spread rumors and manufactured evidence that seemed to support the witchcraft theory. They created fake testimonies from people who claimed to have witnessed Isabel performing occult rituals, and they arranged for mysterious incidents to occur near her flower shop that seemed to confirm she was involved in supernatural activities. The psychological effect on the community was dramatic and terrifying. People who had known and trusted Isabel for years began to view her with suspicion and fear. Customers stopped visiting her shop. Former friends crossed the street to avoid her, and children were warned to stay away from the woman who supposedly used flowers to bring death and misfortune to innocent people. But the most devastating blow to Isabel's operation came when Judge Morrison discovered the full extent of Emily's involvement in gathering evidence against the conspiracy. In November 1876, Emily Morrison was found dead in her bedroom, apparently having taken her own life by drinking poison. The suicide note she left behind confessed to helping a witch use supernatural powers to harm innocent people and beg forgiveness for her role in bringing evil into Silver Falls. Of course, Emily had been murdered by her own father, who had forced her to write the confession before administering the poison that killed her. Judge Morrison was willing to sacrifice his own daughter to protect his criminal empire, and Emily's apparent suicide provided the final piece of evidence that the townspeople needed to convince themselves that Isabel Thornwick was indeed a dangerous practitioner of dark magic. The mob that gathered outside Isabel's flower shop on the evening of November 15th, 1876, was composed of people who had once considered her a friend and neighbor. But fear and superstition had transformed them into a dangerous crowd seeking to eliminate what they perceived as a supernatural threat to their community. They demanded that Isabel confess to practicing witchcraft and leave Silver Falls immediately, threatening to burn down her shop and everything in it if she refused to comply. Isabel faced an impossible choice. She could try to explain that her black roses were part of a legitimate law enforcement operation, but doing so would expose the federal agents who were still working to gather evidence against the conspiracy. She could flee Silver Falls and abandon her intelligence network, but that would allow Judge Morrison and his associates to escape justice and continue their criminal activities. Or she could stand her ground and trust that the truth would eventually prevail, even if it meant risking her life in the process. Her decision revealed the true measure of her courage and commitment to justice. Rather than abandoning the operation that had already saved countless lives by exposing criminal activities, Isabel chose to make one final gesture that would ensure the conspiracy's complete destruction, even if it cost her everything she had worked to build. Standing in the doorway of her flower shop while the angry crowd demanded her confession, Isabel made an announcement that stunned everyone present. She declared that she would prove her innocence by revealing the true meaning of her black roses, and she invited anyone who doubted her to examine the evidence she had been gathering for the past 2 years. What happened next was the most dramatic exposure of corruption in Colorado Territory's history. Isabel opened her shop to the crowd and showed them the detailed records she had been keeping of criminal activities, the correspondence she had maintained with federal law enforcement officials, and the coded system she had developed for identifying members of the conspiracy. Most importantly, she revealed that Judge Morrison himself was the leader of the criminal network that had been terrorizing the territory for years. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Isabel had documented dozens of crimes, identified scores of criminals, and provided federal authorities with the information they needed to bring the entire conspiracy to justice. Her black roses hadn't been marking people for supernatural death. They had been marking criminals for legal prosecution, and the death that had followed were the result of law enforcement actions and criminal infighting rather than supernatural curses. The crowd's reaction to these revelations was swift and dramatic. The anger they had directed toward Isabel was immediately redirected toward Judge Morrison and his associates, who were now revealed as the true threats to the community's safety and well-being. Within hours, federal agents who had been waiting for Isabel's signal moved in to arrest the remaining members of the conspiracy, using the evidence she had gathered to support prosecution for dozens of serious crimes. Judge Morrison himself was arrested while trying to flee Silver Falls with a wagon full of stolen gold and silver. He was carrying documents that confirmed his leadership of the criminal network and provided additional evidence of crimes that Isabel hadn't even known about. His trial became a sensation throughout the Western Territories, and his conviction and execution served as a warning to other criminals that organized corruption would not be tolerated in areas under federal jurisdiction. But Isabel's vindication came at a terrible personal cost. The stress of operating her intelligence network for 2 years, combined with the trauma of being suspected of witchcraft by her own community, had taken a severe toll on her physical and mental health. The revelation that Emily Morrison had been murdered by her own father was particularly devastating, since Isabel blamed herself for not recognizing the danger that her young friend had been facing. Most tragically, the exposure of her operation meant that Isabel could no longer remain in Silver Falls. Too many people knew about her connections to federal law enforcement, and there were still criminals at large who might seek revenge against the woman who had destroyed their network. For her own safety, she would have to abandon the community she had come to love and the business she had worked so hard to build. Isabel's departure from Silver Falls in December 1876 was a somber occasion marked by apologies and gratitude from people who had briefly turned against her. The townspeople now understood that she had risked everything to protect them from criminals who had been exploiting and murdering innocent people for years. Her flower shop had been more than a business. It had been a beacon of justice in a community that had been infiltrated by corruption and violence. But Isabel's work was far from finished. The intelligence network she had created in Silver Falls had proven so effective that federal authorities asked her to establish similar operations in other frontier communities where organized crime was suspected of operating. Over the following years, she would travel throughout the Western Territories, using her flower shops as fronts for intelligence gathering and criminal investigation. The pattern was always the same. Isabel would arrive in a troubled community as an innocent flower seller, establish herself as a trusted local businesswoman, and gradually identify the criminals and corrupt officials who were victimizing honest citizens. Her black roses would mark the guilty parties for federal investigation, and her detailed intelligence reports would provide the evidence needed to bring them to justice. Each operation required months or years of careful work, and each success made Isabel more valuable to federal law enforcement, but also more dangerous to the criminal networks she was helping to destroy. She lived under constant threat of discovery and retaliation, moving from town to town with false identities and elaborate cover stories that protected her from the enemies she had made during previous operations. The most challenging case of Isabel's career came in 1882, when she was asked to investigate reports of organized crime in Tombstone, Arizona, a notorious mining town where violence and corruption had reached epidemic proportions. The criminals operating in Tombstone were more sophisticated and dangerous than any she had previously encountered, and they had connections to criminal organizations throughout the southwestern territories. Establishing her flower shop in Tombstone required Isabel to work under the most dangerous conditions of her career. The town was controlled by multiple competing criminal factions who were suspicious of outsiders and quick to eliminate anyone they perceived as a threat. Local law enforcement was either corrupted or intimidated into inaction, and honest citizens were too afraid to provide information or assistance to outside investigators. But Isabel's methods proved effective even in this hostile environment. Her flower shop gradually became a gathering place for people seeking beauty and normalcy in a community dominated by violence and fear. As customers began to trust her, they shared information about criminal activities they had witnessed, corrupt officials they had encountered, and patterns of intimidation and violence that affected their daily lives. The black roses that Isabel cultivated in Tombstone were used to identify members of the most dangerous criminal organizations in Arizona territory. Her intelligence reports provided federal authorities with detailed information about illegal mining operations, smuggling networks, and systematic extortion schemes that had been victimizing the region for years. But the Tombstone operation also brought Isabel into contact with the most dangerous criminal she had ever encountered, a man named Vincent Black, Vince Carrera, who led a network of assassins and enforcers that worked for multiple criminal organizations throughout the Southwest. Carrera had built his reputation on his ability to eliminate threats to criminal operations with ruthless efficiency, and he had never failed to kill a target once he had been hired to do so. When Carrera discovered that someone in Tombstone was gathering intelligence about criminal activities and providing information to federal authorities, he began a systematic investigation to identify and eliminate the threat. His methods were both brutal and effective. He tortured and killed several people suspected of cooperating with law enforcement, creating an atmosphere of terror that made witnesses reluctant to provide any information that might be useful to investigators. The crisis came to a head in March 1883, when Carrera's investigation led him directly to Isabel's flower shop. He had noticed that federal raids and arrests were targeting people who had recently received black roses, and he correctly deduced that the flowers were being used as a communication system by an intelligence network. More importantly, he had learned that the flower seller who distributed the black roses was a woman who had previously operated similar networks in other frontier communities. Carrera's response to discovering Isabel's identity was characteristically direct and brutal. Rather than trying to capture her for interrogation or eliminate her quietly, he decided to make an example that would discourage any other potential informants from cooperating with federal authorities. He planned to torture and kill Isabel in a public spectacle that would demonstrate the fate awaiting anyone who interfered with criminal operations in Arizona territory. But Carrera had underestimated both Isabel's resourcefulness and the loyalty she had inspired among the honest citizens of Tombstone. When word spread that the beloved flower seller was in danger, a group of local residents decided to risk their own lives to protect the woman who had been working to bring justice to their community. Most importantly, Isabel's operations had demonstrated that organized crime could be defeated through patient intelligence gathering and coordinated law enforcement action. Her methods were studied and refined by federal agents, and her techniques became the foundation for more sophisticated anti-corruption efforts that would eventually bring law and order to the frontier territories. Isabel Thornwick spent her final years in quiet retirement in San Francisco, where she operated a legitimate flower shop that served the city's growing population of transplanted Easterners who appreciated the beauty and normalcy her arrangements brought to their new lives. She never spoke publicly about her years as an undercover operative, and most of her customers had no idea that the gentle woman who sold them roses and carnations had once been one of the most effective law enforcement agents in the history of the American West. But Isabel's legacy lived on in the communities she had helped to clean up and the criminal organizations she had helped to destroy. Towns throughout Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico became safer and more prosperous places because of the intelligence networks she had established and the criminals she had exposed. The black roses that had once marked conspirators for investigation became symbols of justice triumphing over corruption, and stories of the flower seller who had fought crime with bouquets became part of frontier folklore. When Isabel died peacefully in her sleep in 1901, at the age of 58, her funeral was attended by dozens of people who had traveled from across the Western territories to pay their respects. Among the mourners were federal judges, territorial marshals, and ordinary citizens whose lives had been saved by her work. But perhaps the most fitting tribute was the garden of black roses that had been planted outside the courthouse in Silver Falls, Colorado, as a permanent memorial to the woman who had used flowers to bring justice to the frontier. The inscription on Isabel's gravestone, written by the federal prosecutor who had worked most closely with her intelligence operations, reads simply, "She planted seeds of justice and reaped a harvest of peace." But those words only hint at the remarkable story of a woman who had transformed a simple flower shop into one of the most effective crime-fighting operations in American history. The flower seller who had marked criminals with black roses had indeed been involved in bringing death to her customers. But it was the death of their criminal enterprises rather than their lives that she had been orchestrating. Her dark bouquets had been instruments of justice rather than weapons of murder, and the fear they had inspired in criminal hearts had helped to make the frontier a safer place for honest people to build their lives and pursue their dreams. In the end, Isabel Thornwick's greatest achievement wasn't the number of criminals she had helped to convict or the amount of stolen property she had helped to recover. It was the demonstration that ordinary citizens could fight back against organized crime and corruption through courage, intelligence, and determination. Her story served as an inspiration to later generations of law enforcement officers and crime fighters, proving that sometimes the most effective weapons against evil are not guns and badges, but the quiet determination of people who refuse to let injustice go unchallenged. The black roses that had once seemed like harbingers of doom had actually been symbols of hope, evidence that someone was working to expose the truth and bring criminals to justice, even when that work had to be done in secret and at great personal risk. And in the communities where Isabel had operated her intelligence networks, people continued to plant black roses in their gardens as reminders that justice, like flowers, can bloom even in the harshest conditions when tended by hands guided by courage and compassion. If you enjoyed this incredible true story of hidden heroism and frontier justice, subscribe to our channel for more amazing tales from the American West. In the comments below, let us know what you think about Isabel's methods. Was she right to use deception and put herself at risk to fight corruption, or should she have found safer ways to seek justice? Click on the video appearing on your screen now to discover another shocking story of ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things in the untamed frontier.